Thanks to everybody for coming. My name is John Harris. I'm the co-chair of Climate Action Brookline, and this is our panel on why is it taking so long, given the absolute urgency of the climate crisis. Why is, in this case tonight, why is state government kind of moving so slowly? First, brief introduction to what Climate Action Brookline is. There are 3 words to our title. First, we deal with climate issues. We are a citizen group, open admission, really. If you're interested in the issue, let us know. We'd love to have you join in with us. If you have any climate or really any environmental concern, and as long as you're willing to express that concern kind of firmly, but I would say kind of professionally, we would love to have you work with us. Second of all, in our name, Brookline, we are a town-focused group. We are actually the town affiliate of the Massachusetts Climate Action Network, and one of our speakers, Carol Oldham, is the director of the Massachusetts Climate Action Network, and one of our CAB members, Mary DeWart, in the front row, is our liaison. She's a board member of Climate Action Brookline and of Massachusetts Climate Action Network, and a liaison with what's called Mass Power Forward, which is yet even a bigger affiliation of environmental organizations in town. So, Mary, just say hi to everybody, I guess, just so folks know who you are. Yeah, okay. And then the final word in our name is action. This is a group, Climate Action Brookline is we don't just sit and have meetings and have fun. We really want to get things done. Tonight is an example of that. We really are talking about how can we get environmental and in particular climate crisis state-level legislation really going with the urgency that it really requires. The next thing I'd like to do, in addition to our esteemed panel, we have a number of dignitaries in the audience, and just want to give those folks a chance. First of all, we've got a couple of, or one, I think, Brookline Select Board member with Raul Fernandez in the back row there. We have a candidate for currently the Joe Kennedy seat of the United States House of Representatives, Jesse Mermel, in the back of the room. And we've got a couple of folks from the Dave Cavell House candidacy. Where are the Cavell people? In addition to that, we've got Dr. Shwani Jett, the director of the Brookline Health Department. And we probably have a number of town meeting members here. Yep. And then finally, we have a number of members of Climate Action Brookline and Mothers Out Front and Elders Climate Action, which is an awful lot of us. And again, anybody who's not a member of any of those groups, come on up, talk to us about it. We'd love to have you work with us. Okay. We've got 3 people who are roving the audience with cards, and as the event goes on, what we're going to do with audience questions today, so we have a wide range of questions and not just one kind of canalized too many questions. We want to get the questions in cards, and we'll kind of group them and make sure a bunch of topics get asked. So Mary in the front row, and Inga, and then Pat is in the back, and if you guys could just kind of make yourself wander throughout, and if anybody has any questions, raise your hand throughout, and one of our 3 card people will come and hand you a card, okay? And we've got a sign-up sheet in particular outside, in particular email addresses for anybody who is not yet part of our activist network and wants to be. We'd love to have you join. Our speakers, I'm talking way too long, but I'm going to super brief introduction to our 3 speakers. Most esteemed, I guess I would say, is State Senator and Senate Majority Leader Cynthia Cream, represents Brookline. We also have, everybody in town knows him, because he's probably called you recently, State Representative Tommy Vitolo. On the activist side, we have Carol Oldham, as I mentioned, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. And then finally, we have Russ Yancey, a co-founder of a group called Mass Solar, which I know is, my impression of Mass Solar is that an awful lot of their members are installers of solar systems and often mom and pop operations. So depending on how state law goes, either they hire people and they have a mom and pop company, or they don't. And there's a huge loss of skills in many of the smaller towns throughout the state of Massachusetts. So a huge economic impact depending on what happens with state state legislation. And as I say, I've talked a lot already, so why don't we just begin? And we're going to begin in deference to Carol. As I mentioned earlier, CAB is the local affiliate of Massachusetts Climate Action Network. Carol is the big kahuna of that group. So Carol's going to give us some perspective this morning. We're going to start with 2 rounds of 5 minutes each, okay? 5-minute intro, and then your second 5 minutes, you're welcome to either continue your intro or respond to what you've heard. Then we'll have questions from the audience, and those will be 2 minutes each, okay? And you can jump in, whoever wants to answer, or if you question people, if you want somebody to answer, just mention that. And then finally, a 3-minute closing remarks from everybody, okay? So, and our timekeeper, yes, is Christy in the front row? Yes, okay. And Carol Oldham, thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming out this evening. As mentioned, I'm Carol. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. And the way that we work is that we have chapters in cities and towns across Massachusetts, including Climate Action Brookline. We have 59 chapters that represent 108 towns. And we are always welcoming new groups. I would say that our theory of change is that local action has always been the sort of bubbling up place of climate solutions, and we're very focused on climate solutions. We believe that that doing things at the local level, like you all are doing in Brookline Town Meeting, builds local leadership, is good for democracy, it's good for the planet, and it provides a proof of concept for larger level change, for instance, the state level. And we have a firm belief that policy is incredibly important. There are a couple of reasons for that. It has a larger impact than individual action. And as we all know, climate change is a systemic problem, and we need systemic solutions, and policy really gets at that. This is one of my favorite things that's come out of the youth movement is, I have all these wonderful pictures. I was going to show you guys slides, but of young people marching with banners that say system change, not climate change. And I think that's a really important thing for us to all carry with us. And I think we obviously need to get to the scale of the problem. Our solutions need to get to the scale of the problem. So at MCAN, we advocate for policies that make a difference on climate. Obviously, that's a top one. That make our world better and our communities better, and that make local work in communities easier. So for instance, Tommy and I were co-petitioners on community choice aggregation. I almost said aggravation, that's terrible.
You're not wrong.
But now that it's done, it's aggregation instead of aggravation. So this was when I lived in Brookline 4 or 5 years ago in town meeting, we passed it. So every single one of you has cleaner energy because we got this passed at town meeting. That's the kind of policy that I think makes our communities better and makes the world a better place. So I'm excited to have this conversation.
All right. Thank you. Our next speaker is the majority leader in the State House of Representatives, Senator Cream. State Senate, Senator Cream. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. And I think you gave me a segue when you said, why did it take so long? But for the Massachusetts Senate, we did pass, just a week or two ago, a bill called the Next Generation Climate Bill. And that's just what it is. It's looking forward to things that we think will make a better world. I take this very seriously because I have some grandchildren that tell me, hurry up, Grandma, there'll be no planet left. And so I do say that the young people have, as Carol said, between gun action and climate action, the young people have really taken this issue and made it a generational issue, and it is their world that we need to protect. So I do think we're getting there, but as everything else, we always get here slowly. But I'm very proud of the bill that we passed in the Senate. So I'm going to use a few of my moments to talk about that, and then to talk about a bill that I'm the lead sponsor on, which is called the Futures Act. We do have a handout on that bill. It's out there, out on the table. So let's talk about what we did do, not what we can do. I'm going to go through a few of the key provisions. So we set a statewide greenhouse gas limit for the year 2050 of net zero emission. That's something that the governor had mentioned. We did it in our bill. And to do this, we would do this incrementally, but we would require the state to hit near-term limits in 2025, 2030, and every 5 years after. And that would be in sublimits for transportation, buildings, solid waste, natural gas distribution, and other major sectors until we get to at least what we said, 2050. We set up something called the Massachusetts Climate Policy Commission, and we really haven't had a watchdog, somebody who would say whatever we do, however we do these things, the Department of Utilities, or however we pass these laws, we ought to be looking at what better we can do for the climate. And so this would be an independent public body overseeing how the governor handles the crisis of climate change. They're scientists, they're not political people. They're people that have the expertise to recommend to the governor as we go along. We ought to be looking at climate. And so they'd be offering a nonpartisan science-based view of the problem. And the next thing is we reflected on the price of carbon. So there's the issue of carbon pricing and how do we deal with it. Under this bill, the administration, we gave it to the administration. They'd be free to choose amongst various market-based forms of carbon pricing. The governor, without our permission, can sign on to something that's called TCI. It's kind of a cap and trade. And if other solutions in 2030 for residential building. And we hope and expect if either he chooses that or maybe he chooses a different method of carbon pricing. But any mechanism that he chooses would be used in an effort to minimize the impact on low-income households, disadvantaged communities, and vulnerable manufacturing sectors. And there would be money that we would get, and we would use it to look at the climate and make decisions, given that we need to think about those communities that are living in places where they're more affected by issues of climate. I'm running out of time, so we also provided direction to the Department of Public Utilities. We found that they really weren't doing what we wanted them to do. So we're requiring them, we gave them a mission statement. They need to think for the first time when they take action, they need to think of public safety. And that comes to what happened in the Merrimack Valley. They need to consider that when they make issues. And what I'm very excited about, which would encourage natural gas adoption, the bill would authorize a pilot program to go into effect that would consider renewable thermal energy. And that's the first time that Eversource has a pilot. But that pilot might not have been allowed by the Department of Public Utilities. And in this bill, we said that that pilot would go forward, and we would permit the gas company to bill for thermal energy, and we would ensure transparency and validity of the outcomes through a third-party evaluator.
Thank you.
There
Senator
are
Green-
the things which I will
Yeah.
use my rest of my time to talk
And your
about.
second 5 minutes, yeah, exactly.
And after
Representative?
that,
You all find a way to say what you want to say. I mean, that's all. Representative Vitolo, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tommy Vitolo. Actually, before I start, I see at least one candidate for townwide office in the room, John Van Scoyac, who's running for the Select Board, who I'm sure will raise his hand. If there are any other townwide candidates, now's your chance. Seeing none, I'll move on. So I've been a state rep for about 13 months. New to the job, still figuring out where all the elevators and restrooms are in the building. Before I was elected as a state rep, I worked for a firm called Synapse Energy Economics for about 10 years, working as an expert witness and analyst primarily in electric sector issues, sometimes natural gas. My clients were almost always government agencies, formerly federal, not so much since 2016, certainly state agencies, consumer advocates like attorneys general, and environmental organizations like Sierra Club or NRDC or some of the other big ones. And I would work primarily in three different areas. I worked on some coal retirements. In fact, just this week, the city of Springfield, Illinois, announced they were retiring 3 of their coal units. That's a project I worked on for about 5 years and persuaded them with others to retire about 400 megawatts of coal. So that was great news of the week for me anyway. I also did work on solar PV, specifically a complete valuation so that utilities and investors and commissions could understand exactly what all of the different values and costs solar PV was imposing on the system, so that by recognizing that full set of benefits, we could actually get more deployed. Recognizing that it's more valuable than folks were claiming initially meant that we could get more installed on the system. And I also was an expert working with municipal governments. And so, you know, if Eversource is your utility, they want to do something, they go before the Public Service Commission. They have a docket where experts on all sides hash it out and figure out what the right decision is. But for a municipal light plant, there's none of that. You know, you have a mayor or a city council, and the city council has personal injury attorneys and real estate salespeople, and, you know, folks who care about their community who have no real expertise in the issue, and they tend to do very poorly in thinking about what they ought to do with their power plants. In fact, this Springfield, Illinois case, the municipal light plant was losing $30 million a year and still couldn't bring themselves to close the dang plants. So I became an expert in that as well, and that's what I've spent most of the last 10 years of my career doing, learning a few things about the energy sector and how it relates to climate. Before that, I got a PhD at Boston University in systems engineering, which sort of set the stage for all of this. All of which is to say, I have real expertise on the technical side of what exactly in the United States, in Massachusetts, in Brookline, is contributing to climate change. And the short answer is burning fossil fuels. The longer answer I could take all night on. But the question then becomes, how can I use those skills, and this is really the point of the night, how can I use those skills to influence policy, right? That's a whole different game. And you know, I want to mention Senator Cream is a rock star on the policy side. She has got, you know, every year easily a dozen really, really forward-looking progressive bills. And, you know, if we would just pass a couple of them each session, we'd have a much better place to live, I got to say. No doubt about it. I have a bill that I'll probably talk about in the next 5 minutes called the Spark Act. I am delighted to say that a portion of the Spark Act, in fact, the first section, was taken up by the Senate in an amendment. And so if we are able to pass the Senate's climate bill in its totality, at least part of that will be language that I came up with Senator Chandler related to just transition. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, you know, that's me in a nutshell. Oh, 1 minute or conclude? What do we think? 30 seconds. Split the difference. That's sort of my background and where I'm coming from, and I think we'll spend the next 5 minutes talking about particular bills and ideas in the State House.
Let's see, for the first round, our final speaker again, Russ Yancey, please.
So I own a small solar company here in Massachusetts called Avid Solar, and I was started in the solar industry about 10 years ago and moved to Massachusetts in 2012 to start Avid Solar, and pretty much immediately started to get involved in the policy side of what was going on here in Massachusetts. It was an interesting environment. It was an attractive environment. I came to Massachusetts because of the support of solar policy. I came from New Hampshire, where I learned about public utility commissions the hard way. I was involved in initially the energy efficiency business up there as an entrepreneur looking to get into it, and discovered that the utilities, through their energy efficiency programs, had found the plum position in the entire industry because they were able to effectively control the programs through their control of the subsidy dollars. They were able to tell contractors who could they see, what they could charge, what they could offer, and it was a very limited growth opportunity in general. And it's not too different here in Massachusetts, and I'll get back to that later. But it allowed me to intervene and get to know how utility dockets work and things, which is kind of an arcane space, a quasi-judicial type of proceeding. And so with that knowledge, I began to chime into what was going on here in Massachusetts on the policy front, and then quickly got engaged with the Solar Energy Business Association of New England, which is a trade association here in Massachusetts. And I joined it just about at the time it was about to go underwater. It was an organization that the Mass Clean Energy Center had founded a little over around 15 years ago. And unfortunately, they decided that we're going to take the training wheels off. We've subsidized you enough to help bring the industry together so it could advocate for itself. But unfortunately, when they pulled their support apart, that organization almost tanked. So I joined up to see if I could help it recover a little bit. My timing was a little auspicious. At the same time, we were trying to negotiate a transition between SREC 1 and SREC 2. And what we discovered in the middle of that process was that in the back room, there were some large solar organizations, national organizations, and large developers that were holding a parallel set of discussions regarding what happens after SREC 1, privately, independently, with no input from the local solar community. So that led to the organization of Mass Solar. Mass Solar was a bunch of smaller solar companies, small to regional, generally under 100 employees, 2 to 100 employees, I would say, from across the state, that said we need to do a better job advocating, representing ourselves. And so we started this grassroots advocacy organization because we figured even though we didn't have the money, we didn't have a full-time regulatory affairs staff, we had the numbers. We had more employees. We covered more townships or cities or towns and cities across Massachusetts. We were present everywhere. So we decided to begin to organize. We weren't necessarily going to lead the policy fight or come up with the best policy, but we were going to get behind what we thought was great solar policy. And then we decided to form allies in the environmental community and to develop a force locally that could collectively be a presence here on Beacon Hill and in developing good policy at the municipal and at the state level. And so far it's been fairly effective, or it's been growing, it's been developing. It became organized as a nonprofit. Although it hasn't really taken up much in the way of funding, it's very present now on Beacon Hill, and it's known, so it's established a presence. That said, I'm here to represent my own opinions this evening. I have stayed very engaged after my 3-year board term on CBANE, the Solar Energy Business Association in New England. I've individually, tried to keep engaged in policy at the federal and state level in front of the Department of Energy Resources, the Department of Public Utilities, and on Beacon Hill. And so if you want to go in deep on solar policy, I'm your guy. I also look forward to providing some ideas regarding what collectively citizens can do across Massachusetts, both locally, at the state level, and nationally, to accelerate the transition to a clean economy. Thank you.
All right. Round 2. Carol, another 5 minutes, if you'd like it.
I probably won't take that long, but I just wanted to flag a couple things that I heard some of the other speakers say. I think the Next Generation Climate Bill is very forward-looking, and that there are a lot of really good pieces in there. I think a challenge that folks are probably aware of is that the House holds power very close, and it is very concentrated in the House. And I guess a challenge that I see is, and a conversation that I've had with multiple senators is there a way for the Senate, I think that it's very easy when you're in one co-equal body to say, we've done our job and now it's your turn. And, but I think the real issue, to your grandchildren's point, is like, we actually have to save the planet. And so is there a way for the Senate to, there can be a really difficult dynamic between the bodies, but is there a way for the Senate to bring the House along on some of these things, because I think because of the concentration of power, it can be a really difficult body to get things done in. A lot of stuff gets pushed to the last minute and then doesn't happen at all because there's no time all of a sudden. But I think, I guess my challenge that I have brought to multiple senators that I've sat down with is there a way for the Senate to help the House act? And, you know, I think that the bill reflects the scientific consensus that we need a 50% reduction by 2030. That's a really heavy lift, and we need to get going on it. We can't just assume that the House might do it next session. You know, I think we're all feeling a lot of urgency and a lot of fear about what's happening to our planet, and I keep thinking that there's got to be a way that we can all help each other move forward. So I think that's my challenge to all of you.
Second round, Senator Cream, please.
So I will get to that, but I did want to just, I'm on a course here. So I did want to say there were 3 bills. So that bill, the next generation, we also did a bill which set deadlines converting MBTA buses to all-electric power, accelerating the transitions of cars and trucks and buses to carbon-free, which is a second bill. We tried to offset the Trump administrative efforts to slow progress on efficient appliances, and we did an act to update the energy efficiencies of appliances, and we continued to provide the rebates for all-electric vehicles. So we did not just do the one thing. I do want to answer that question, but I don't want to lose an opportunity to give a plug for the Future Act. So I will come to that in a moment. But so the Future Act, this is the first time when gas leaks were identified in Newton, including 600 that had been repaired and 271 outstanding, people started to notice that it wasn't just the Merrimack Valley, but that gas, what people thought was a good thing, was not. It is a fossil fuel. And with the leaks and the methane that comes from gas, people got out and said, what are we going to do here? Gas adds this dangerous gas leaks, and there's 6 months to repair them. So what the bill that I am the lead for with Lori Ehrlich, a representative from the Merrimack Valley, is that we would take the gas companies and bring them to the table. We are making a statement that the gas companies have to fix the leaks, that we want to prioritize, look at the leaks that are closest to schools, look at the leaks that are closest to trees, give people an opportunity to be able to bring suit against a gas company because of the loss of the trees that are affected by gas leaks. But the path forward to renewable energy might be through geothermal. Geothermal has not been tested that much here in Massachusetts, but I was so pleased, and I don't know how many of you read, that Boston University has just built a building, and since Boston University is my alma mater, they're building the city's largest carbon-neutral fossil-free building, which will be using geothermal, and that building is happening right here. It's a great test to the geothermal. So the Futures Act says to the gas companies, come, maybe we shouldn't be spending $9 billion to try and redo gas pipes. Maybe we ought to either do new pipes or retrofit the old pipes. Maybe we ought to do some renewable energy for instead of natural gas. And that's what the Futures Act did. So when you talk about, before I get to how we can help the House, I realized that there was a bill that was going through the Senate, and there was nothing in it about the natural gas, because originally the next generation bill was really about renewables for electricity. Not that I don't think that wind and solar are really important, but we also need to look at natural gas. And so it required me sitting down with them and saying, if you're going to talk about next generation in the same sentence, you have to use the word future. and the future belongs to natural gas as well. And that's how the pilot program came in. That's how the change in the mission, adding safety into the language for the mission for the Department of Public Utilities happened. It happened because we sat down and made it clear that we needed to do something on natural gas as well as electricity. And so it's a matter of working hard. And how to work hard, we have people like you, mothers out front, heat, all of the gas people, all of the climate action people that aren't just in Brookline, Newton, and Wellesley, which is my district. But as I went to sit down with the people in the Senate, they said, oh, yes, those mothers, they're everywhere. And they say, no, not the ones that want the gun control. They're the ones that want the climate action. But it is a matter of making a voice, and I know how hard you're doing that, but being out there everywhere. And I'll use my last few minutes to talk about working with the House. So, thank you.
Representative Vitolo, 5 minutes, second round.
Sure. So I want to talk a little bit about what the House has done, and then some of the things I've been working on. About 6 months ago, we passed a bill called GreenWorks, which is $1.3 billion specifically for city and town governments to use on both climate mitigation and resiliency, right? And so cities and towns are themselves trying to figure out what they can do to both reduce carbon emissions from the actual functions of city and town government and prepare for worsening storms, both to solidify the buildings and also to provide spaces for the population to come in the event of an extreme heat wave or in the event of a horrible winter storm. And the idea behind GreenWorks is cities and towns are trying to figure out under Prop 2.5 how to balance this year's budget. So asking them to think 5 and 10 and 15 years ahead and fund it is a real challenge that most cities and towns are facing, and GreenWorks would help pay for that. That's a bill the House has passed, the Senate has not yet taken up. I'm hopeful, when we take up the Senate bill, the Senate takes up the House bill, we'll get them both done. We also had a couple of nice budget amendments the last time around that I think were subtle but important, not the home run I'm hoping we hit this year, but worth mentioning. One was an amendment filed by Pat Haddad, and it was really key to the next round of offshore wind. The way the legislation was written several years ago, it made the RFP for this tranche of offshore wind difficult to sustain, frankly, because wind came in so cheap the first time around. It was unlikely that we would be able to beat it this time. And so an amendment there allowed for offshore wind, that process to continue, and if President Trump would finally give approval, you'd see some construction there and really substantial amounts of offshore wind. We're talking, I think, between the two tranches, 1,600 megawatts. And so it was a small amendment that didn't get a lot of press, but was really important to making sure that that second tranche was even legally possible. In that same budget, we also funded EV More, which is a program I really like. It helps, frankly, middle-class consumers get themselves electric vehicles. It's not going to help you buy a Tesla. The price cap for the automobile is something like $40,000. Subject to correction, might be 50. And so it's designed to help middle-class consumers transition to EV. Again, it wasn't a home run, but it was a really important budget extension. We needed more money for the program because it was so popular. It was oversubscribed. A couple of things that I've been working on. I'll start with a mention about MBTA and mass transit. Getting more folks on the T is part of addressing the transportation emissions. It's not a huge part, frankly. Most of it is just not burning gasoline. But it is an important part. And so I've been working on everything from station improvements in Brookline to, as I announced actually yesterday, Brookline has finally broken through with the MBTA to deploy transit signal prioritization on the C line so that the green line gets the green light, right? This is, Brookline passed a $50,000 item in its budget in 2014, and we couldn't get the T to take the money and spend it. And I finally had a meeting of the minds with the general manager actually at Symphony Hall, And a week later, they met with Todd Corain and a consultant. The equipment's on order. We expect it will be installed sometime this spring, just in time for the sea line to be closed the entire month of July. But that's how it is sometimes with the MBTA. By the time all of that's done, I think you'll have a faster, smoother, and more reliable ride in the fall. But I do want to get to the Spark Act, which is a bill that was in many ways inspired by some action Brookline has taken. The idea of the Spark Act is really simple. When the state government spends money on a new heating system, it must be clean heating. When it spends money on a cooling system, it must be clean cooling. And what that means is no oil, no natural gas, period. We're not asking it out of everybody. We're asking to start with state government. If we can't do it, it's impossible for us to ask anyone else to do it. The reason why I wanted to go in the direction of gas in buildings is because, frankly, renewable electricity has some champions. Sean Garberly, Marjorie Decker. For automobiles, Carolyn Dykema is a great champion for EVs. And transitioning our heating of buildings from gas to clean is a little newer of an idea, but critical if we're going to hit 80% by 2050, or as the Senate and the governor have said, net zero by 2050. We also need to do heating systems. They tend to last the longest, and geez, in Massachusetts there are millions of them. And so we need to get started transitioning them from oil and gas to electric. And the way we start that is stop installing new ones, right? Let's stop digging. Brookline did it with Warrant Article 21, más o menos, and the idea is to get us started at the state level as well. Section 1 of that, which relates to a just transition, relates to teaching technicians, engineers, architects how to do this, is included in the Senate bill, and I'm grateful. Section 4 is the part about Massachusetts no longer spending money on oil and gas heating systems. I'm hopeful we can get that in the House version of the omnibus climate bill, and then the House and Senate can negotiate about what will be included in the final bill.
Thank you. Russ Yancey, 5 minutes, second round.
Brookline is very lucky to have these two, the senator and representative representing you on Beacon Hill. Natural gas still heats 50% of the homes in Massachusetts, just a tad over 50%. It is not a bridge fuel. It is the cause of it is the largest contributor right now to carbon emissions in the building space in Massachusetts. So the other thing that natural gas does provide is the generation of electricity in Massachusetts is more than 50% fueled by natural gas. And so it's depending on which day it is and which season it is, all right? But roughly, it's a significant portion, and what we need to be doing is finding ways to bring that back, whether it's demonstrating that clean heating and clean cooling are cost-effective and very possible, or trying to figure out for the utilities how to reuse their infrastructure for good by using it for district heating, geothermal through the pipelines, or even figuring out how to insert hydrogen as a percentage of the fuel that's going through those pipelines. But back to my lane here a little bit. So there are a couple of things I'd like to talk about at the state level regarding solar, because to achieve that clean heating that Representative Vitolo is trying to get to, it presumes that you have clean electricity. Again, to get to clean electricity, we need to come up with more renewable energy sources and wean ourselves off of the cheap natural gas that we have. Of course, cheap means not counting all of the consequences associated with combusting that fuel. So to try and advance solar power a little bit, there are a few bills right now on Beacon Hill, and it would be great to have your support on them. One of them is House Bill 2866. Representative Haddad, Pat Haddad, actually is a sponsor of this bill. She was Queen of Coal, as you may recall. Then she became the Witch of the Wind. Now we want her to become a solar advocate. Pardon? No. So
In a friendly way.
no, she named herself that way. But what she's doing is she's fighting for the folks down on the South Shore around New Bedford, where they had a coal-fired generator. And then she transitioned on to clean fuel, and she's trying to set that up as a gateway for the clean wind offshore clean wind industry. And what's also interesting is New Bedford and Fall River in that area, I think it's actually New Bedford has almost as much PV per capita as any other municipality in the country. I think Honolulu may be a little bit ahead, but it's odd in that they have a lot of solar going into that area as well. And so she's come out in support of it, and it's great, because we in the solar industry felt that all good solar legislation went to the House to die. It never made it past leadership for whatever reason. And one of those reasons is that when the Baker administration came in, they explicitly campaigned on Beacon Hill that there will be no additional solar incentive program until we have significantly reduced the subsidy called net metering. So I'm very happy that we have Tommy Vitolo, an expert in net metering. Thank you, Brookline. Get him on to the Joint Committee of Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy so he can be a voice of reason regarding what is the value of distributed generation, and specifically solar. It is direly, it's needed up on Beacon Hill right now. So House Bill 2866 with amendments that removes net metering caps for behind-the-meter solar. Net metering was always meant to offset somebody's local load. Virtual net metering was a loophole that was inserted for companies that may have more facilities, but one good one for solar, and then they could take that and then share the net metering credits to the others. Some developers came in and drove a train through that, and we ended up with solar farms and virtual net metering, which was accidental. So what we're trying to say is, back to those people that are trying to self-generate clean energy for themselves, remove the net metering caps, just for them. Associated with that, we also need House Bill 3622. Somebody here actually is a co-sponsor of that bill. Thank you. And what that bill does is it provides this energy storage incentive program that is independent of whether you install new solar, which is the only way you get an incentive right now for storage. We have over 90,000 PV facilities in Massachusetts right now. They do not have an incentive to add storage to support the grid when it's most needed, when it most needs that stored energy in the evenings to gain better utilization of the grid. And then there's another bill that I'd like to call out, which is House Bill 3677, and it's about grid access and interconnection reform. And when I get another couple of minutes here, I'd like to come back and talk about what we need to do to better work with the utilities. And fundamentally, if I could just extend for 30 seconds, is we need to change the way our utilities are compensated, because right now their shareholder interests are aligned against the development of distributed generation and clean energy in Massachusetts. We have to move their cheese. They get no shareholder benefit. They see us as the competition. Energy efficiency, there's a shareholder incentive. Distributed generation, clean energy, there is none unless it's a large project like offshore wind, where A, there's a transmission line required, and B, that has to go over the distribution grid, and oh, by the way, C, they get a contract override of several percent that goes to their shareholders for being the administrators of that contract. But for clean energy here in Massachusetts, they get Zippo. So guess how much support we get from them? Zippo. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I do want to thank Russ in particular, because one of the questions was asked was in fact about House Bill 2866, and you went in great detail, and that's very helpful. Number two, I also want to just mention a question came in about the geothermal question that's been brought up by Senator Cream. A group called HEAT, Home Energy Efficiency Team, based out of Cambridge. They are the people who publicized the problem of crumbling natural gas pipelines in Greater Boston and got some action happening on that.
I gave them a shout out.
Oh, yeah.
With mothers. I did, with heat.
Okay, and their next project is that when you open up a trench to clear out the cracked older pipeline, why put in just another natural gas pipeline because we want to wean off natural gas? Instead, why not put in a pipeline for fluid for geothermal to move heat, heat out of the earth in the wintertime, and to insert heat back deep in the earth in the warm weather. And a month from today, Cambridge Heat is going to, they have gotten a willingness from the chair of Eversource to do a 3-neighborhood pilot program to try this out beginning as early as this October, and they're going to tell us about it at the CAB monthly meeting 1 month from today. So stay tuned to that. Now, a lot of questions have come in, and they're fantastic. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to start kind of with the most general, and then kind of start to narrow down. And first, these questions are kind of really the reason why we're here today. I'm going to combine 3 different ones. What are the roadblocks to policy change? Again, what are the most effective ways to advocate at the State House? How to advocate, how to meet the crisis schedule, and in particular, how to make an implementation plan, and then related. Could you speak about the role of lobbyists? Do they monopolize more of your time? And this is to the electeds. Do lobbyists monopolize more of your time than constituents or advocates? And that's a lot. We said we'd do 2 minutes, but I'm not sure we're going to. Don't worry. So I suppose let's start with the electeds, if you don't mind, on that. Is that okay? So, yeah. Anyone who would like to respond?
We're both going to respond, so.
Okay.
We do it as a team. That's the House and the Senate. Okay.
Fist bump it.
So,
We're still working on the details.
There you go.
okay. So, back to heat, though. I mean, that is how we get things done, by having grassroots people, not just here, but everywhere. So the roadblocks to policy change is really, there are so many bills filed, thousands of bills get filed, and we take up them as they come, and the more activity we have, the more likely we are to take up a bill. That's how policy changes. So when I jokingly said the mothers out front or heat or climate activists, the fact that they're all over the state and that they're introducing, it goes to the answer to your question as well. They need to be in the Speaker's district. They need to be in districts outside of where we would say we're more progressive and we look at these things. So I can't speak for Representative Vitolo, but I can guess that there are no bills that you would mention that both of us wouldn't be supportive of. But we're not necessarily the majority of the people in our legislature. And so policy comes when a lot of people make noise, and now climate is really, people are making noise about it. And so that's how change happens. And how do you advocate? You advocate by getting together with people in other parts of the state, which you know well, because that's how you get the change. Lobbyists are good. They don't spend more time than constituents. For me anyway, the time that constituents write to me and call me are far greater, and I am persuaded often by constituents that come in and bring something to my attention that I really was unaware of. I read their letters. There are policy letters. All those bills that get filed, I have to admit, until they come out of committee or they go to Ways and Means, I don't really know the ins and outs of all of those bills. We look at them, we say, gee, this is interesting, that's interesting. I have spent most of my career in the criminal justice field. I'm a lawyer, I practice law, I've been involved in criminal justice reform, I chaired judiciary, I chaired criminal justice. That has been my interest. And so I look at those bills quickly and not have to spend so much time. But now I'm looking at other bills because people are calling me. I've been very much involved in gun control. That's been an issue that I've had many different bills, and those bills have passed. And so it is making you aware by your constituents of what is of interest to them. I mean, I couldn't possibly represent Brookline without being interested in these kinds of things. I'm the lead sponsor on pausing facial recognition. Everything that I do, all these great bills, Brookline's done them already by town meeting. But it is the fact of lobbying and how important that is outside of this district. And so that lobbyists don't monopolize my time. But if there's one issue, it's helpful to have the lobbyists come and talk about that. But my concern is the utilities probably are the ones that have the lobbyists. That's where the money goes.
Representative Vitolo.
what she said.
You
So-
go first next time.
So roadblocks to policy change. I think that making noise in a lot of districts across the Commonwealth is hard, but it's what gets a lot of attention. And so, I encourage everyone here to contact my office. Most of the time when I get an email from a constituent, I write back, Dear Mary, thank you for contacting me. I co-sponsored that bill, and I'm working hard to, gain support in the building. That's usually the response, which in some ways might be satisfying, but in other ways it's like, well, now what do I do, right? So when was the last time you wrote a letter to the editor of the Globe talking about climate change? Because it turns out it's not just people in Brookline and legislators who live in Brookline who read that, right? When was the last time you had a conversation with a friend of yours in a district that isn't quite so bright blue as Brookline saying, hey, this is important to you and it's important to me, and are you making sure it's important to folks in your town and your representatives outside the district, right? If you go to Winthrop and knock on the speaker's door, I'll hear about it the next day, but you won't move his needle at all because you don't live in Winthrop, right? You've got to lobby your legislators, and we're here, and lobby us. We're almost certainly on board with you already. And so how can you raise the issue statewide? Transportation is buzzing right now. Why? Because people are stuck in traffic and people are on lousy MBTA service vehicles across the Commonwealth, not just in Brookline, right? And so you've really got to raise the attention across the Commonwealth, which is not an easy thing to do. And I'm not suggesting, that it's your fault it hasn't happened. It's all of our fault. But if you want a legislative body to take action, it's got to matter to more than just a couple of reps. And so how to advocate? Yeah, show up at the building. Show up at the building with friends. Matching T-shirts are a hit. And when I say with friends, not just friends from your neighborhood, because then you're all coming to my office and, we rah-rah together and we share our experiences, and then I continue doing exactly what I was doing before because we agree. Get folks from other communities showing up too. It's really important. The question was asked about lobbyists. The small solar builders have a lobbyist, right? That's a perfectly good lobbyist to listen to. Lobbyists, in some ways, are really nice to work with because you know exactly what they're up to. They tell you, right? I work for this industry or this company or this union, and these are the things that are important to us. And that transparency actually makes it pretty easy, right? That doesn't mean that they always get their way. And let's be clear, the maximum contribution a lobbyist can give an elected official in Massachusetts is $200, right? So lobbyists have a role. The ones who are good, and most of them at this point who are still in the building are good because the ones who weren't have been fired years ago, they recognize they're going to be working with us on different issues across different years. And if, you tell me something that's not true today, I stop taking your calls. And so lobbyists are actually pretty good about telling it like it is, at least the best way they can. Do I spend a ton of time with lobbyists? No. For one thing, I've been in the building 13 months. People don't come to me first to get a lot of things done. Let's be clear about that. I spend more time with advocates and more time with constituents for a variety of reasons. But frankly, some of the best advocates behave like lobbyists. They're experts on an issue. They know all the legislators by name. They know all of our staff by name. They stroll in the building every day, right? And in some ways, they're indistinguishable. And that's fine because in both cases, in fact, in all cases, everyone who comes to us, whether they're an advocate, whether they're a lobbyist, whether they're a constituent, has a point of view and they're trying to get something done that they want to see happen. And it's our job to be skeptical of everyone and to ask questions and to try to understand both what their perspective is, but also what other perspectives are so that we can put it all together. I spend a lot of time doing that, a lot of time trying to find not the other side of the issue, because there's never just two sides, but other interested parties to better understand what is it that makes this tough, and is there a place where we can find consensus or move most of what we want forward with relatively little pain. And in some ways, that's what the House and the Senate are trying to do, is where can we find overlap relatively efficiently and move that forward and not get stuck on the places where we're not quite seeing eye to eye. It's a challenge, and it's one that, I work on every day, and I know Senator Cream does as well.
All right, thank you. Carol or Russ, would you like to weigh in on that one?
Sure. I would just say that I am actually a registered lobbyist. I'm up there representing.
She's one of my favorites.
He says that if you're in the room. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to be a lobbyist. I think, my take on it, sort of goes back to the idea of system change, which is that right now we have a system that's not working for most people. And that has to do with sort of the overreach of corporate capitalism. And that we need to change that, and people power is the way to change that. I would agree with Tommy that your network is important. Find ways to engage your family and friends. I think one thing that this job has really taught me, and being at MCAN has really taught me, is that it is a lot easier to sort of stick your neck out and be brave when you feel like there are others along with you. And so be that other for people in communities who might not have that in their own community. And then I would say also one thing that I feel really strongly about the climate community is that focus is not our biggest forte, and that we could use a little bit more of it. I think that's one thing. Mary mentioned the Mass Power Forward Coalition. I think one of the things that we at MCAN really like about being part of the Mass Power Forward Coalition is that we have chosen 3 bills that are our top priority, and those are the ones that we are advocating for as a coalition. And that's a big deal, right? Like, that is a very small number, and it is a really hard choice. And it helps a lot when we're going in to talk to folks like these folks here today to be able to say, these are our 3 things, because that's manageable versus here are 28 top bills, right? Nobody wants to hear these are our 28 top bills. So that would be my 2 cents.
Russ.
Thank you. So there have been a couple of times where I've actually worked with lobbyists on behalf of the solar industry, and I learned some things from them that I thought were really helpful. One was, simplify your message. What are the 5 or 6 key things you want? Then step back. Or 3, but for us it was 5 or 6. We got lucky. We didn't get them. We got 3. So it was our lesson. The other thing was keep it simple. Let's get each one down to a simple sentence, a bullet point. Be able to communicate what it is very succinctly. Another great thing about lobbyists is they know how the sausage is made. Who knows what Joint Rule 10 Day is? Right.
It was last week.
We missed it. So all the bills had to be reported out. So they know these steps in the procedure that are important up on Beacon Hill that we'll never know about. And so that can be helpful to help you navigate through. Some of the experience in working bills through can also do that. So another thing is they know who the influencers are on particular topics, like whether it's facial recognition, net metering, whatever. You got to think that Beacon Hill, if you read the Boston Globe, is tackling a huge, broad array of issues. Education, healthcare, where does solar fall into all of that? Maybe every other year we get some attention and we do some good work on it. But, you have to recognize that they're dealing with a lot of stuff, a lot of very complex issues with no right answers. And so we need to kind of put ourselves into a little perspective and find our moment. Another nice thing about working through the legislative process, I guess, is that the folks that I've met with, the representatives, and I've gone around and knocked on doors, is the ones that care about you the most are the ones, again, I think I'm just echoing a point, that represent you. So if you can bring a grassroots set of folks, a couple 100 people up to Beacon Hill, make sure they're targeting their own senators and representatives. because they speak the loudest. So a coordinated, simplified message, a few key points, focus on the folks that represent you, that can be successful up on Beacon Hill. Know when to strike and, work with allies to come together to advance your message. Thanks.
All right, thank you. We've got a whole bunch of fantastic questions, and just for a change of pace, I'm going to focus on a particular industry or area right now. And in transportation, we've got questions in two different areas here. The transportation sector is 43% of greenhouse gases in Massachusetts. But Massachusetts transportation policy centers on moving cars and trucks. Brookline's warrant article 31 from last fall has a new focus on moving people and goods by all modes. By the way, I apologize. We did get a couple of questions in advance, and that's why I'm reading from a printed thing. Again, Brookline's warrant article 31 has a new focus away from cars and trucks and toward moving people and goods by all modes. The most vulnerable modes are also the most energy efficient and have the least impact on the environment. What can Massachusetts do to improve the use of non-car modes? And by that, we're talking about walking, micromobility, which is bikes, scooters, e-bikes, electric, adult tricycles, etc., and public transportation. And anyone who would like to tackle that one.
I'll go first.
Thank you, Tommy.
I'm not going to give you an answer that you want to hear, though.
Uh-oh.
And I'm going to say this, to be clear, I'm 41 years old. I haven't owned an automobile for 20 years. My spouse does not own an automobile. We have a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old, and we are a car-free household. We take the T, we ride bicycles, both bike share and our own. We walk. We occasionally get an Uber or a Lyft or a taxi. We occasionally get a Zip car. We occasionally rent a car, right? So this is coming from someone who lives the very lifestyle you described. In Massachusetts, last year, or maybe it was 2018, there were roughly 2 billion passenger miles on mass transit. Number of miles per person, right? 2 billion miles. In automobiles, there were 60 billion. So if we triple the amount of mass transit ridership, it's 10% of automobiles. And let's be clear, all of those houses in all of those suburban towns, they're not getting knocked over. They're still going to be there. And so when we think about climate, we need to think about electric vehicles. There's no amount of bicycling and walking and subway riding that will get us around that. There's none. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do those things. Those things are really important from social and economic justice perspectives. They're really important for economic sustainability. But we are not going to scooter our way out of dealing with climate and transportation. We have to get all of those cars and trucks to be e-cars and e-trucks, and there's no if, and, or but about it. And I know that that is not kind of what that question was fishing for. We should keep doing those things. Bike lanes are important. Protected bike lanes are even more important. Sidewalks with curb ramps and without tree heaves are really important, right? A subway that gets us from here to there on a regular basis on time, super important. But those things get us from 2 billion passenger miles in transit to 6, and maybe reduce from 50 billion miles on autos from 60 billion to 50 billion. But if you care about climate, you've got to focus on getting cars and trucks, not to, higher mile per gallon, but to 0 gallons of gasoline. You've got to work on e-vehicles. That's where the action is if you're focused on not reducing our emissions by 20% or 30%, but by 80% or 100%. It's got to be e-vehicles.
Senator Cream?
So, backing into e-vehicles, so the Senate bill, and you'd be happy to know that it provided a permanent statutory authorization for the MOREV program, which is a program that you're so interested in. So in Newton, we're doing a lot of things with biking. We have a very strong group of people who are supporting biking, and we've done a lot by making bike routes, changing the direction of traffic, and encouraging people to do a lot more biking. As Tommy says, so Newton is one step outside of Brookline. I grew up in Brookline, but living in Newton, I don't live near T, so I don't have the benefit of saying I'm a no-car family. It's a long walk down to Newton Corner bus. But, so we need to think of other things, and those other things are electric vehicles and making sure that we do things like that. But what has been working on is this regional program, regional transit. So for outside of this particular area, we've put in a lot of money and effort into regional transit. My hope is that that might be something that we would look at if we did get money back from the cap and trade program, that we would reduce and make it no cost to have regional transportation. That would certainly move people along because it's hard living in Brookline and Newton thinking about regional transportation. But that is something. We're doing something with development. We're requiring on one of the pieces of development right now that the developer provide a vehicle to drive people from that development to Newton Center to the T. That's a way to move people in a way rather than having all the cars. We're looking at the garages owned by the MBTA and how do we, maybe we make them provide, there may not be as much parking, so they're going to have to provide vehicles to bring people from wherever that parking lot is to a public transportation. Housing around transit housing is another thing to look at, so that people are as lucky as living in Brookline, they're living near public transportation, which might be in other parts of the state. So there are a lot of things going on, but I agree that we need to also consider the electric vehicles. And the other thing that the bill did is require more stations, more public access to charging stations, that when you develop these places, that you have more places to charge your car, because it's no good if you have an electric vehicle, but you have to wait in line to charge it. So there are a lot of things out there, and it's not just one answer, so I kind of agree with
You know, just, we did get 3 separate questions about EVs, but I just, on talking about, again, the micromobility walking public transportation part, Carol and or Russ, do you folks have?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. One is that a lot of our communities in Massachusetts are a little bit older, so they actually have denser downtowns. I think, you know, Tommy's right. Not everybody is going to get out of their car, but we can get a lot of people out of their car for a lot of their uses. And we can condense the uses that folks are using their cars for or using a shared car for. I think, you know, one of the advantages of living in a state where a lot of the communities are a little bit older is that we actually have the infrastructure in place already to have denser downtowns, to have more connected neighborhoods. And I think we should go ahead and take advantage of that. I think I really want to echo Senator Cream's point about housing and building near transit, and this is my moment for my unpopular statement, which is Brookline needs to be denser. I know you guys feel like Brookline is very dense, but we need to go up. This was something that I always felt when I lived here and served on town meeting. There's a lot of opportunity. There are a lot of places that are single story right next to the T, which is insanity in this moment, right? Because we should all be as lucky as Tommy that we live right near the T and that we can bike to work or to the grocery store. And then I would just say we need more affordable housing. I think we need more, you know, sort of regular affordable housing, but also deeply affordable housing. There are a lot of communities in the Boston area. Boston's actually doing a fairly good job at building affordable housing, but there are a lot of communities that are not. We need to do more affordable housing, and it needs to be net zero affordable housing so that the people who live there are not put at a disadvantage in the long run. Lastly, I would just say that who has seen the Carbon-Free Boston report? Okay, so a couple folks. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting that came out of that analysis was that it was over 80% of the vehicles that come into Boston or that are driven in Boston come in from surrounding communities. So if we improved our transit, if we improved our regional transit, that would make a huge difference for air pollution, for traffic, for quality of life, as well as for the climate. So I think that that's a really important thing for folks to think about.
Russ?
Just a quick thing, and it's kind of complementary. So we could make electric vehicles a lot cheaper or more cost-effective or easier to own if we had bi-directional charging of electric vehicles. So if you think about a car, the Tesla battery or any car battery is about 3 to 4 times the size of any battery you can ever buy from me and stick in your basement next to your electrical panel as a backup power source. It's like a battery on wheels. And it can provide significant value to the electric grid if it's allowed to provide electrical services when it's parked. And there's plenty of opportunity to do that when you drive home and plug in your car and still have that vehicle fully charged up for your commute the next day. You could make thousands of additional dollars with a bi-directional per year with a bi-directional charger if it was allowed. That will not proceed without legislation and leadership from Beacon Hill. You will not see that voluntarily come through the DPU or the Department of Energy Resources. It's going to require leadership on Beacon Hill to force that to happen. And it's going to start out as a pilot, and then it'll be rolled out to everybody else. But I encourage you to push that issue. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. And that answer, by the way, complements. We have 3 questions relating to electric vehicles, and luckily they complement each other pretty even further. First of all, how will you help the common citizen purchase and use an energy-efficient personal vehicle when current prices and technology may not match our ideal mass EV adoption plan? Representative Vitolo mentioned this already, but my peers and I have difficulty envisioning how this will happen. Further, why does the state vehicle excise tax fail to take fuel efficiency and electric vehicles into account? Could a change in the vehicle excise tax help to shape vehicle choice? And then, related, again, a question that came in advance. Ride-share businesses like Lyft and Uber increase traffic congestion in the city, block travel and bike lanes for pickup and drop-off, and lure those who can afford to pay for ride-share away from less polluting public transportation. But if the ride-share cars are all hybrid or electric, they could help with greenhouse gases. Could state legislation be enacted to mandate this? Anybody?
Private.
Say again?
Yeah.
I'll go. Sure.
Thank you.
I like transportation stuff. So the first question was, how do we help citizens buy electric vehicles? All citizens. Well, there's 2 tools the legislature has. We have carrots and we have sticks, right? I actually prefer to use sticks. It's just not very popular. If we increased gasoline by $1 a gallon in taxes, people would very quickly figure out how to buy EVs. Certainly, the upper half of the income scale, the lower half would have a much harder time, right? But we could take that $1 per gallon of gasoline and use it to subsidize EVs for everyone else. Look, the EV transition is not going to happen in a year or 2. And, you know, Elon Musk, I'm not a big fan, but he was pretty bright in figuring out that make EV sports cars first and let rich people pay for the R&D, and it worked. The U.S. government subsidized quite a bit as well. The More EV program is an attempt at it, right? One of the hard parts is there are not an awful lot of EV vehicles targeted toward lower income folks, right? There are not a lot of inexpensive EV vehicles out there. And so it makes it a bit of a challenge for Massachusetts to figure out how to make that connection. What I think we're doing effectively right now through the More EV program is encouraging what I'll call middle-class consumers to purchase EVs, and that moves us in the right direction. But Massachusetts is 6 million people out of maybe 7 million people out of 300 million. We can't move the entire market by ourselves. We're kind of looking to states like California and even New York to keep pushing in that direction as well. And I think right now More EV is about as much as Massachusetts can reasonably do. I'm not interested in overly subsidizing automobile purchasers at all, right? I mean, I actually would rather us spend that money on reducing fares for the T. Certainly my district, I think, would prefer that. but we're working on it, right? I don't think we're in a bad spot there. I don't think the excise, there was a question about the excise tax. I don't think the excise tax incents much of anything because, frankly, it's really low. After your first or second year of car ownership, the excise tax is a trivial portion of the cost of owning a vehicle. And so not only is it not at the sticker price, which is where the biggest incentive is, when you're at the dealer looking at the price, the excise tax isn't there. But it quickly becomes such a small part of car ownership that if you want an effective policy, if you want to nudge people, I don't think the excise tax is where it's at all for that impact. I'm not opposed to a proposal like was mentioned, but I don't think it would be remarkably effective. I take a different view on TNCs, Ubers and Lyfts, than most, because the fact of the matter is that Uber and Lyft exists allows my family to not own a car. And so while it may be true that sometimes somebody who could have taken a subway, this sort of class of people who are destined to subways, we've sort of assigned them this lower tier, might take an Uber or Lyft instead. For my family, if we owned a car, yeah, we'd drive it. And the fact that we have TNCs allow us, in part, to not own a car. And you know what that means? That means that we don't drive the car when it's a little bit rainy, because we don't own one, right? We walk, or we take the T, or we stay home, or we get a TNC. I think there's this idea going around that it's the TNC's fault that there's a lot of congestion because they're the new thing, but it's the other 90% of the automobiles on the road that are causing 90% of the congestion. And this idea that car owners are free from causing the problem and we're going to blame the riders of TNCs, I think is kind of an okay boomer moment for us as a society. My colleagues in the House disagree with that. When we do transportation revenue, we're going to tax the heck out of TNCs. I'm not a fan of it. It's likely to happen. I just think it's a little bit wrong-headed. I think we should look to the 90% of the problem that's caused by individuals driving their own automobiles around, or individuals calling Amazon, and it's the Amazon truck blocking the lane, right? Or the DPW of Brookline blocking the lane, right? It's not just TNCs. They're a problem, but I think that it's overstated because that's the thing that other people use, not the thing that the bulk of people use. And I think that's a speck in our own eye.
All right, thank you, Tommy. Two questions or cards about EVs came in after I met. So, Tommy, we'll give you one more shot if you want. But first is the question of cost of EVs. Someone wants to tell us that a Nissan Leaf costs about $32,000 and a Tesla Model 3 costs about $36,000 for what it's worth. And then here's the final one related to EVs. How confident can I be, this is a person who wants to purchase fairly soon, or lease fairly soon, how confident can I be that electric charging infrastructure will be in place in 2 years so I can buy a full electric? How soon can EV charging infrastructure be built out? And that to anybody.
It depends on how far you want to go, right? If you're driving to and from work every day, my bet is your house already has electricity. And so you're good to go.
No, you have to put in special.
No, you don't. Yeah, you don't.
I was told I couldn't.
It's a slow charge, but you got all night.
Oh,
right?
Well, Tommy, don't you need 220 or
you don't?
Yes, I was
you don't,
told we needed.
You don't.
Oh,
You can do 110. It's a slow charge.
it's a slow charge.
It's not recommended, but it can be done. There are public spaces. That's not so easy unless you happen to live right next to Town Hall.
What about 110 overnight? Is that possible?
That's my understanding. But again, it's a slow charge. But if you live in Brookline, right? That's right. It is a slow charge. But this is my point: is if it's to meet your needs of the next day, it may well be okay. It depends on how far you're going.
Okay.
That's right. It's not for everyone. No single option is going to be for everyone. If you are a garage orphan, which is what we tend to call people who don't have a covered parking spot that is sort of deeded or has their name on it, it's tougher, for sure. And the town is working on deploying some charging stations. But realistically, we're talking about deploying like 20 charging stations along Beacon Street, which is helpful, but not going to solve that kind of problem. If you're a garage orphan, it's tough right now. There's no question about it. If you're really lucky, you can charge at work.
Okay. In cab, we're going to have further events about the technique, or I should say technology of EVs. It's obviously a very hot topic, but we have folks who haven't weighed in at all on EVs
Yeah.
at this point.
So I'm just very I think, let's go back to the question. It was about cost, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm very sensitive to that. My husband and I were looking for an electric car, and we figured out that it would be so many years before we'd get back any money that we saved on it, that it was huge outlay, and I found it disappointing myself. I don't have answers, but I can say that the cost was so high. So there is a matter of, well, if you raise the gas tax, which I don't know if we'll do that, people will be looking more into electric cars. Maybe we need to have a bigger insurance rebates. But I guess I'm repeating a problem and don't have an answer, but I found that it really, I'm looking at the people that are driving the electric cars, and they're pretty wealthy people, and that a Prius, someone said, look at the Prius, but I wanted to get the electric version of a car, and it cost so much more than the regular version of a car that I found it was disappointing. But again, if you have insurance rebates, if you make it harder to use the gas, I think, consumers will.
Nudge.
But the more people want the car, the price goes higher. So I know that many of the manufacturers are seeing the problem with these electric cars, and I don't know, maybe if we don't buy them, the prices will come down. But I found it disconcerting, too. I found it disappointing. More of a problem in affording the car than having the charging station, because I think we're going to have charging stations.
Okay, Carol or Russ on EVs.
So I would just say that I would encourage the decision makers amongst us to think about, I think one of the things that I've heard really loud and clear in my conversations with low-income advocates around electric vehicles is that a rebate doesn't, if you're low income, a rebate doesn't work, right? So if you're getting your money back 6 months, 9 months later, that doesn't work. So thinking about a discount or a prebate apparently is one term for it. I would encourage folks to think about that. I also want to respectfully disagree with Tommy about the Uber and Lyft congestion issue, because I have seen studies of major cities, Boston included, that show that there is a substantial increase in downtown traffic from Ubers and Lyfts. And so I do think that there are some ways that we need to rethink. I agree that having some sort of a shared vehicle can be a way to not have a single occupant vehicle as a household, but I think that we're still working out what the boundaries need to be on these things, but I think we're not there yet. We still need a few more guidelines.
Russ, okay. You're a solar guy, you're a PV guy, not a right, stationary guy,
Which is
right?
good for charging.
Right. Okay, I'll tell you what, get ready. Thank you, 2 separate questions about a subject that has been burbling under the surface in Brookline for a couple of years now. But get ready, and I hope you have your seatbelts fastened. Why are we not including nuclear power? It is non-carbon. And further, why close nuclear power plants like Pilgrim when they are already built and they produce electricity and are not fossil and without burning fossil fuels? Japan is building coal plants after closing all of its nuclear plants. Would anyone like to tackle that?
I'd like to take the first shot at this. So the reason that Japan is closing their nuclear power plants is because they are very dangerous. I used to work in New Mexico. I worked for the Sierra Club out there. I worked with a group of Navajo activists on the Navajo Nation to try to stop a coal-fired power plant there. The health issues that I saw surrounding the open pit uranium mines on the Navajo Nation shocked me. I had no idea that people were living like that in such close proximity to facilities like that had no cleanup plans. Every old person was sick. All the young people were getting sick it is not an acceptable way to generate electricity when we have so many better alternatives that merely do not have the political will available for them. So I am not in favor of nuclear power.
You want it?
Russ?
Just as a numbers guy, as a business guy, I think the reason you don't see new nuclear plants going up is because they're not cost effective. They can't compete. So the new nuclear cannot compete against the alternative forms of energy that we can contract, whether it's natural gas or, more importantly, whether it's wind and solar. They're both currently more cost effective than a new nuclear plant. And I think the reason why you see some of these zero carbon emission plants going down and not coming back up again is because they've lived a long and useful life. And again, an economic decision is being made that maintaining them can be more costly than just shutting them down in a responsible manner. That's my understanding.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of maybe emphasize it a little bit. We're seeing nuclear power plant owners who, by the way, made unbelievable fortunes when the wholesale price of electricity was high, walking around hat in hand in Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey, saying, we need subsidies or we're going to close. And the subsidies that they're securing are absolutely enormous when compared to the kinds of subsidies we've talked about for wind and solar, the PTC, the ITC, and others. And it's because the fixed cost for nuclear power plants to construct is incredibly high. There are three nuclear power plants that were constructed or attempted to construct over the last 15 years. One was Watts Bar by TVA, which was already like 80% finished, and they finally finished it, and they did that one relatively cost effectively. The other two are Vogtle and VC Summer in Georgia and South Carolina, respectively. VC Summer is a $14 billion hole in the ground that will never be completed. $14 billion. How much PV could we buy for $14 billion, right? Vogtle is in Georgia. They're still trying to get it finished. It's about $25 billion all in. Maybe not quite that high, but getting there. And here's why they're able to do it. Because they were able to convince their legislature something that they'll never convince a Massachusetts legislature to do, which is guarantee the power company the money to pay for it, even if it doesn't work. And so the ratepayers in South Carolina in 2069 are going to be still paying for a hole in the ground that was dug, in the 2010s. No nuclear power is getting built, but they're paying for it anyway. The problem with nuclear power, whether or not you buy into the safety arguments, is we can't afford it. It's just not a very good deal.
Senator Cream?
I don't have it. I know that people have asked that question, and I heard they're afraid that people are afraid of the dangers of a nuclear plant. That's been come back to me even more than the cost, so I don't have really anything more to add.
Okay, we're just in the interest of time, I'm going to combine, they're kind of related and kind of just to see how you do that. First is how you handle that. First, what programs could provide funding for cities and towns for climate adaptation and preparedness? We've got problems, but we don't have funds in the town budget. And I'll tell you what, let's just go with that one on its own right now. And who would like to handle that first?
You said it first.
Oh, yeah. So, Tommy had mentioned it earlier, and I think the governor is well on board with this as well. There's the Greenworks bill that came out of the House. Chairman Golden, I think, was the primary sponsor of it. But it's an excellent bill to help towns, municipalities across, it's over $1 billion in budget, to help towns build out their resiliency capabilities. Think about what you do in an emergency, or if the power goes out, how do you get back, how do you provide essential services, as well as other climate mitigation or adaptation measures. And so I think the state is stepping up, and you'll see support the House and the Senate, as well as in the executive administration, to support these efforts. So we're budgeting for it now. We recognize it's going to be a decades-long process of preparation.
Anybody else?
Sure, I'll just also flag the municipal vulnerability preparedness this program. MVP is what everybody always calls it. And I don't remember how many P's there are. But that is something that is actually already giving grants to communities. And I'm going to express another unpopular opinion, which is that I think that their budgets and their budgets, right? And we need to think about communities that have large budgets, not taking grants that could be going for communities that have very small budgets that may have a more urgent need, but not have the same kind of staff to apply for them.
Senator Cream?
I think we have some issues on Proposition 2.5 here, too.
Huge.
Proposition, sorry. We have some issues on the communities that are hitting the Proposition 2.5.
Overrides.
And overrides, and how they need to deal with that situation if they're going to be able to put more money into climate adaptation. Those are all issues. The Green Works bill is a bill that initiated in the House because funding bills need to initiate in the House. They cannot initiate in the Senate. I think there's hearings on that, and I think there's bonding. I think that will happen over time. It isn't. It is not going to be a quick fix. I don't see it as one where we have issues of bonding and where that. But it is something that would be looked at in that bill, obviously.
You're good? Yeah. Okay. Basically, again, for the electeds in particular, how are we reaching out to small businesses in terms of meeting climate goals? Big industry will self-fund, but small businesses are strained. And in particular, a private business that was mentioned, a little hard to read the words here, but carbon footprint, need to educate condo owners, real estate management, and large property owners. And that's a question for the elected people. Small businesses rather than large, and then property owners.
Well, in the bill that we passed, we looked at people that we looked at low-income people, we looked at small businesses, we used language that they would be considered in our decisions. There isn't a bill that necessarily deals with that, but again, that is part of the issue of the inequities of being able to make sure that these are available to low-income people, to low-income communities, and to small businesses, that they too can take advantage of that. I think we put language in the bill that made that required the commission to consider that, that required the Department of Public Utilities to consider it, but there's no specific amount or set aside for the small businesses.
Mr. Vitolo.
So we talked about this a little bit on the Joint Committee for Community Development and Small Businesses, on which I serve. A good example of doing it well is our energy efficiency policies. And so all of us, when we pay our electric bill, put a small amount of money into the EE programs. And there are EE programs for residential customers. There are also EE programs for businesses. And they'll go in and they will switch out the lighting for LEDs and install thermostats that can be programmed around the hours your business is operating. And it turns out those work out really well for small businesses, particularly those who don't own the building they're operating in, right? There's this additional challenge. The building owner isn't paying the heating and lighting bill. It's the tenant, and the tenant can't go making all those changes. The tenant doesn't own the building. So EE programs are a good example of how to bridge that gap. Another point is that very often we make large businesses do things we don't make small businesses do. So, for example, in Boston, if you want to build a building in excess of 50,000 square feet, the BDPA is going to make you do some things from a climate perspective that they don't make smaller building developers do. And so we oftentimes, and I think it's good policy, ask the wealthiest, in this case the largest businesses, to go first and pave the way. And work out the kinks and drive down the market price so that we can then follow up and ask smaller businesses, or on the residential side, lower income folks in our population, to then do the rest once we've driven down the price. But you know, every industry and every policy, trying to get that right in every single one, we don't always get it right. But I think those are two examples of how we do in fact get it right, and have programs for all businesses where in fact small businesses find it most easy to participate, and then policies where we just ask larger businesses to do it first.
So can I have one more?
Sure.
So in the future bill, Futures Act, we're asking for that small efficiency tax for the gas as well, like when you do it on your electric bill, a per therm charge, so that we can do that on our gas bill as well. So it's a great program. Of course, the future bill hasn't been passed, but that's another
Yet.
element of the bill. And my understanding is, and I'm sure the House will too, the Senate intends to take up another gas bill this session because we didn't deal with the gas leaks. And so that might be something, that's a great charge, but I'd like to do it on both electric and gas.
And here's another question for the electeds, and I think really this will be, just in the interest of time, the last question before we go to your folks' closing statements. Again, for the two elected people, is the very specific questions about specific bills. Is the next generation climate bill similar to the roadmap to 2050 bill, which also mandates net zero by 2050, and the roadmap bill versus the 100% renewable Garbelli-Decker bill? Which one is best? Which one will have the best chance to succeed for the two elected folks?
I'm not familiar with bills that are in the House. I'm not familiar to make a comparison between, I love Representative Decker. We do a lot of things together. I'm sure it's a great bill. I'm not in a position to make a decision whether one is a roadmap to, and one is better than the other, because then I'd be really foolish if I didn't say the Senate bill's the best bill you're going to find. But I don't know enough to say that. My hope is this is a segue to say, we did something, we need to do something in the House, we need to get together and do something even better. And when more minds get together, we come up with better solutions. And I'm the first to say, there's probably a lot of things out there that are even better, or not better, but can add to and make what we did a better bill.
Yeah, I like that answer. So the first question was, is the next generation climate bill similar to roadmap? Yeah, there are some things that are similar, and there are some things that are totally different. As the roadmap name suggests, it's a vision on getting from here to there without a ton of prescriptive details. Whereas the Senate bill, I think, sort of drilled down into some areas and said, do this, and do this, and do this, with more specificity. But I'm going to push back a little bit on the framing. There's no rule that says we can only do one climate bill in a session, and we have to take it exactly as initially proposed and pass it. We can mix and match. We can take some from here and some from there. And so, the Garbelli-Decker bill is focused on renewable electricity, which is really important, right? We've got to decarbonize our electric grid. It's not enough. Right? We also need to decarbonize transportation, which the Senate bill, takes a bite out of. We also have to decarbonize our heating sector, which we've both talked about several times tonight. And so, it's hard enough to get something passed without us working against each other, right? So the idea of, should we do this or that? No, we should do both. Let's get to it.
All right, thank you. There are two questions that actually, one question, just in the interest of time, one question came in about gas leaks. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the topic of the entire CAB meeting 1 month from today is going to be about natural gas leaks. And so I would encourage that person to attend that meeting and to ask whatever hard-hitting questions you have of the CAB, the Cambridge Heat people, because they have been working that issue for years now. And then the question that came in about what to replace your 40-year-old natural gas-fired boiler, that's a technical question rather than a policy question. So let me just recommend that person, we've got a couple of tech weenies here in the audience, right?
I have an answer.
Oh, you have an answer?
Yeah.
A super quick one, and then we'll get to concluding remarks.
I would encourage folks to look at, it's a hybrid hot water heater or a heat pump, basically. Yeah, so.
Okay. This is boiler in particular,
Yep.
not just hot water heater.
Yep,
Okay.
yep. So there are, in fact, hot water heaters that are used for both domestic hot water and your boiler. So you can get one thing that does both systems. They're not cheap, but there are some decent incentives, and it will last you a really long time.
All right, thank you. And then this is just to kind of frame everybody's closing remarks. A particular question that gets really kind of interesting. If Governor Baker pushes for property transfer taxes to be applied to climate change, will you support prioritization for climate change initiatives over competing initiatives such as housing initiatives? If you could fold that in, again, just in the, gets weird, just into your closing remarks. And we could go in the same order on closing that we started with? Yeah.
Sure, so that, I
And
think.
this is 3 minutes for closing.
So thank you to whoever teed that up. So MCAN is in a coalition called the HERO Coalition, which stands for Housing and Environment Revenue Opportunities. We've come together around sort of a meeting of minds around the governor's bill on the housing tax and the Greenworks bill, and basically what we have realized is that the housing crisis and the climate crisis essentially have a similar solution, which is better communities and better housing and more affordable housing in the right places. So I don't think it's an either or. There is actually a proposal that I think the senator is probably aware of. If not, we should talk, which brings together both of those communities. And the idea is that instead of increasing the deeds excise a little bit, which is what the governor has proposed, that we actually double it, which still leaves us well below surrounding states. And it hasn't been raised in 50 years, by the way. And it would provide a lot more money for affordable housing and for climate solutions. And of course, there are ways to do our affordable housing that is in itself a climate solution. So I think that this is a real opportunity for a win-win proposal that addresses two crises at once in a way that makes our communities better.
Senator Cream.
So I also think that we need to be able to look at both of them and not be a either-or solution. I'm the lead sponsor. I have been for the past 10 years for the Community Preservation Act, which increases the deeds excise, which looks at the deed excise tax, and that creates open space, housing, lots of very good things. I'm committed to that. I've done it for 10 years. It's moved along. May not be as important here, but other places it really provides a lot of housing. It's hard. It's hard if you talk to climate people, it's number one. You talk to housing people, it's number one. So I'm inclined to be able to look at the two of them. We talked about housing in transit areas. We talked about how not putting gas hookups in new construction. There are things that we can do to maybe satisfy both constituencies. And was that part of my closing?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Can I just, I'm sorry. No, please. I don't want to abduct a question that was asked to me in the beginning about the Senate bringing the House along. I don't, in all due respect, think that's the way to go. Nobody, I think that the House would be resentful that we in the Senate had to be the ones to bring them along. I've done a lot of these debates, and it's difficult. I've done them in Brookline, Newton, and Wellesley, and I have a great relationship with all of the representatives, and one of the ways that is that I respect them and they respect me. My hope is that what has to happen is there have to be activists elsewhere convincing the House how important these issues are, and we have to have a different bill, and we have to move the needle here. But it won't work if the Senate says, come along, we did it, it's your turn. It's just not the political reality. There's too much competitiveness. We have people who have the best ideas and nobody wants to give in. I'm being honest here. Nobody wants to be, I led you and I'm the leader and you're the follower. It's just a recipe for disaster. I think we need to work in Winthrop, as my colleague here says, knock on those doors in Winthrop and get the speaker's people, get those mothers out, get those heat people out, make the gas leak in Winthrop on the same street. I'm just saying that's going to move the needle. And I'm a firm believer that we need to work and respect one another. And if we do that, we'll come up with a better bill. I've been on various conference committees. We just did criminal justice reform that nobody thought we could do. And we didn't get it all, but we got more than we thought. And we only did it by walking out and respecting one another. That might not be the answer you wanted.
Representative Vitolo, 3 minutes for closing.
Sure. And so my colleague in the Senate mentioned Winthrop. I actually didn't bring it up. Someone else did. It's not about Winthrop. It's about all 160 districts, or at least the 127 that are in Democratic hands. I won't speak for my colleagues in Second Division. You know, it's not Speaker DeLeo who sort of just arbitrarily decides what the House is going to do. In fact, he is constantly talking to all of us about what's important to us. So if you want something to move in the House, convincing him is actually the last thing that happens, not the first thing. You've got to convince everybody else. And that's not so easy, particularly in the House, because our districts are small and remarkably different from each other, right? And so Boxborough is a lot different than Belchertown. And getting something that works for reps from both of those districts is just not so easy. But that's all the more reason why making issues region-wide and statewide is so critical, not just the district where a particular member of leadership lives. And again, it's not easy. Transportation got really big really quickly. I'm not sure exactly why. You know, we were number one. We're Boston, we're Titletown, so we were number one in congestion, and that got people really excited about it. I don't know what the right sort of buzzword is around climate statewide, but I hope we figure it out, because I do think that the broader the coalition across the Commonwealth, the easier it's going to be to get a big climate bill done. And the fact is, we need to get we need to hit at least a double or a triple every single session for the next 10 sessions in a row if we're going to get to 80% or net zero by 2050. There's not a single bill that's going to get us there. We need to have a big bill every session. The Senate has sort of played its cards on climate, and I love that the Senate put out a big aggressive bill. I actually don't like the way the Senate did it, because it wasn't a specific bill that was kicking around in committee that folks in the House had seen already. So essentially the House started last week with, okay, here's the big bill to consider. But it's the Senate's prerogative, and frankly, the House didn't go first, so I don't fault the Senate for moving on it. But I didn't think it was a way that was destined to generate consensus. There's no reason why it can't, and I'm hopeful the House will put forward a bill that is similar enough that the conference committee can resolve the differences. My preference would have been to pass specific bills like the Future Act or like the Roadmap or like another bill sort of as standalone, but the House didn't do that either. And so I'm not going to begrudge the Senate for putting a big climate bill forward. My hope is that the House can also put forward a big climate bill this session, and that we can work it out in conference and either get a governor's signature or override him.
All right. Russ, 3 minutes. Final remarks, please.
So you're very lucky here in Brookline to have these two here listening to you so intently and getting it, and also to have folks like Carol, who has helped the state over the course of the last 10 years really begin to develop municipal action groups across the entire state. And folks like John and the other members of Climate Action Brookline, I say thank you to all of you. Because next time when the solar industry tries to do something about advancing clean energy, we know that we can call upon you as allies and to be those 5 to 10 folks that call them up and say, you know what, we do think you need to make this fix to net metering, or whatever, or energy, or make that energy storage available, incentive available to everybody. And we now know that it's important to be able to craft that into a message of 5 to 6, maybe 3 clear points that we want to get across to them. And we know that showing up in their office to let them know, perhaps in matching T-shirts, that it does really matter to us. And it's not necessarily the same 3 people they see every week, but rather 3 people from their neighborhoods. That makes all the difference. And so I'm encouraged by the folks that have come out here tonight and who come back month after month. And I think that we can get a lot of stuff done. And it starts out with a few bills this session and then a few more bills the next session. And gradually, I think we can get there. So I'm hopeful and I'm grateful for everybody showing up here. Thank you.
All right. I want to thank everybody. The questions that came from the audience were just phenomenal. Surprised me how good they were and how probing they were. And I think we've learned an awful lot about the strengths and the personalities of all of our, and where you fit into the ecosystem, the political ecosystem of the state. So I want to thank every one of our speakers as well. And I also want to thank Morgan, who's the guy behind the scenes, who's keeping the speakers running and all the AV system and all that business, who never gets thanked, who works this room every event that is here, and he's behind the door there as we speak. So I do want to thank everybody. It's just been a great event tonight. Thanks to everybody for coming.
And thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let's do a picture. Let's do a group photo.